Truc Lam suddenly lifted her tiny hands, reaching into the air as if trying to grab something she couldn't hold yet. That's when Trieu Duong realized his daughter was ready to start exploring the world with her hands, but there was nothing safe for her to hold. So after finishing his morning chores, he quietly decided to make a small handmade toy just for her. But would this simple gift be enough for her first real touch of the world? If you enjoy warm and heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Morning came gently to the small house. A pale strip of sunlight lay across the floor, and baby Truc Lam was already awake beneath her thin blanket. Her eyes moved, from the doorway to the roof above, then to the light on the wall. Lately, she had started doing that more and more. She no longer only lay quietly after waking. Now she watched things, followed movement, and sometimes lifted her tiny hands into the air as if she wanted to take hold of what she saw. Trieu Duong noticed it as soon as he bent over beside her. He smiled when one of her hands rose again. Her fingers opened toward him, then slowly curled back. She still could not hold much, but the wish was there. She wanted something near her, something safe and small for those little hands. "What are you trying to catch this morning?" he asked softly. Truc Lam answered with a quiet sound and kicked her legs once under the blanket. Trieu Duong carefully picked her up and held her against his chest. One hand supported her body, and the other kept her close and secure. He took her outside for a little morning air before feeding her. The yard was still peaceful. Chickens were moving near the fence, and the vegetable patch waited for water. It was an ordinary morning, but when Trieu Duong looked down at Truc Lam, it felt meaningful. She was changing in small ways every day. He sat down and fed her slowly. She drank quietly in his arms while he watched her face. After she finished, he lifted her upright against his shoulder and gently patted her back. "That's right," he whispered. "Slowly, little one." When she gave a tiny burp, he smiled and kept holding her for a moment longer. But even then, she was curious. Her eyes moved to the edge of his sleeve. One hand lifted again and brushed the cloth. Her fingers tried to close around it, but slipped away. Trieu Duong looked at that small effort and thought for a moment. He had already made something for her to look at before, but this morning he could see she needed something else. Not something hanging where she could only watch it. She needed something she could hold. Something light, smooth, and safe enough for a baby. Maybe even something that could make a soft sound when moved, so she could slowly learn that her own hands could cause something to happen. The idea settled in his mind immediately. A small handmade toy. A little rattle-like toy she could touch now, grip with help, and one day shake by herself. He looked down at Truc Lam and smiled. "So this is what you need now," he said. But first, the morning chores had to be finished. Trieu Duong carried her back inside and laid her in a shaded place where air could still move around her. He checked the cloth beneath her and made sure no direct sunlight reached her. "I'll stay close," he told her. "Let me finish the work first." Truc Lam blinked up at him, calm and trusting. He stepped into the yard with a bowl of feed and scattered grain for the chickens. They rushed toward him at once, pecking busily at the ground. The movement and sound caught Truc Lam's attention, even from inside. Trieu Duong looked back several times while working. When the chickens settled, he moved to the vegetable patch. The rows of greens were healthy, but the soil was drying under the morning sun. He filled a container with water and moved slowly from one row to the next, pouring carefully around the roots. Again and again, he turned to check on Truc Lam. She was awake the whole time. From where he stood, he could see her arms lifting now and then. Once, both hands rose into the air, as if she were trying to catch the light itself. Another time, she turned her face toward the doorway and seemed to follow him with her eyes as he crossed the yard. Each little movement made him more certain that his idea was right. By the time the chickens had been fed and the vegetables watered, the yard had grown quiet again. The wet soil smelled fresh. The birds were busy with their grain. The morning still felt calm. Now Trieu Duong could begin. He went to the side of the house where he kept simple materials for small repairs and handmade things. He searched through them slowly, choosing only pieces that felt right. He selected a smooth section of bamboo and a few light wooden parts that could become a small toy for a baby. Since it was for Truc Lam, he checked every piece carefully with his fingers, making sure there were no cracks, splinters, or rough spots. Then he sat under the shade and started working. His movements were patient and steady. First, he trimmed the bamboo to a smaller size that would suit tiny hands better. Then he smoothed the surface again and again. Any sharpness had to go. Any rough edge had to be softened. He wanted every part to feel gentle against Truc Lam's skin. From time to time, he paused and looked over at her. She was watching him. Her bright eyes followed his hands with quiet focus. Once, when he lifted one small piece and turned it in the light, she raised her hand toward him again. That made him laugh, softly. "You're already waiting for it, aren't you?" He kept working, shaping the simple materials into a small toy he hoped would suit her well. It did not need bright colors or fancy details. It only needed to be safe, light, and easy to hold. In his mind, he could already imagine it in her tiny hand and the soft sound it would make. So he continued with care. He checked the shape. He tested the balance. He pressed gently on each joint part to make sure nothing would loosen. To anyone else, it might have looked like a very small task. But for Trieu Duong, it meant much more than making a toy. It was another way of answering Truc Lam's needs. He saw her hands reaching more each day, and he wanted to give her something that matched that curiosity. Little by little, the shape of the toy began to come together in his hands. Trieu Duong lifted the unfinished piece and looked at it carefully. He was not done yet, but he could already see what it would become. A small handmade toy for Truc Lam to touch, hold, and one day shake by herself. And as he sat there working, with his daughter watching from nearby, the moment felt full of quiet meaning. A father using his own hands to make one more gentle thing for the little girl he loved and protected every day. Trieu Duong held the finished toy in both hands for a moment before bringing it over to Truc Lam. He did not rush. Even after all the careful work, he still checked it again, pressing lightly on every joint, running his fingers along the handle to be sure it was smooth enough for her delicate skin. Only when he felt completely certain did he move closer and kneel beside her mat. Truc Lam noticed him immediately. Her eyes shifted from the doorway to his hands and then fixed on the small object he was holding. It was something new, something different from anything she had seen before. Her tiny arms lifted again, and her fingers opened as if she were trying to reach it already. Trieu Duong smiled, lowering himself so she could see more clearly. "This is for you," he said in a soft, warm voice. He did not place it in her hand right away. Instead, he let her look at it first. He held it just above her line of sight and moved it gently from side to side. The toy caught a bit of light as it moved, and when he gave it the smallest shake, it made a soft, gentle sound. Truc Lam blinked once, then stared with full attention. Her entire expression changed. There was a quiet focus in her eyes, as if she were trying to understand what she was seeing and hearing at the same time. Her hands rose higher, both of them now, moving slowly but with purpose. Trieu Duong watched closely. He could see that she was ready to explore, but he also knew she needed help. So he brought the toy down carefully and let it touch her palm. At first, her fingers only brushed against it. The contact was light and uncertain. She did not hold it yet. "That's okay," he whispered. "Take your time." He lifted it slightly, then tried again, guiding it gently back into her hand. This time her fingers curled a little more. Not strong, not steady, but enough to rest against the smooth surface. For a brief second she held it, then it slipped away. Trieu Duong let out a quiet, warm laugh. There was no disappointment in his face, only pride. "That was good," he said. "You did it." He placed the toy beside her for a moment and gently rubbed her belly, letting her relax before trying again. Truc Lam responded with a soft sound and kicked her legs once, as if she was pleased by the attention. After a short pause, he picked the toy up again. He shook it lightly near her, just enough to remind her of the sound. Her eyes followed it immediately. Her hands rose again, reaching toward it in a familiar way now, as if she remembered. Trieu Duong guided it back into her hand once more. This time, he supported her wrist with one hand while placing the toy in her palm with the other. Her fingers closed again, slightly firmer than before. He held it there with her, letting her feel the shape and weight. For a moment, the toy stayed in her grasp. Then her arm moved. It was not a controlled movement, not intentional in the way an adult might think, but it was enough. The toy shifted, and a soft sound came from it again. Truc Lam paused. Her eyes widened slightly, and she stared at the toy as if something new had just happened. Trieu Duong leaned closer, his voice full of gentle encouragement. "You made that sound," he said quietly. He repeated the process several times, always slowly, always with patience. Sometimes she held it for only a second. Sometimes she only touched it and let it go. But each time, she seemed a little more aware, a little more interested. Once her fingers closed just enough that when she moved her arm, the toy shook again. The soft sound followed, and Truc Lam blinked as if she were beginning to connect the movement with what she heard. Trieu Duong smiled wider at that. "That's right," he said. "Again." He helped her once more, guiding her hand gently. There was no force, only support. He wanted her to discover it in her own time. Around them, the house remained quiet. The breeze moved softly through the doorway. Outside, the chickens scratched lazily at the ground, and the watered vegetables stood fresh in the sunlight. Inside, the moment was even more peaceful. A father and his baby sitting close together, sharing something small but meaningful. After a while, Truc Lam's movements began to slow. Her arms were still lifting, but not as often. Her eyes remained fixed on the toy, but her blinks became heavier. The new experience had tired her in the gentle way that learning often does. Trieu Duong noticed right away. He lowered the toy and placed it beside her where she could still see it. "You did enough for today," he said softly. He rested one hand lightly on her chest and used the other to stroke her head. His movements were slow and calming, helping her settle. Truc Lam turned her face slightly toward the toy. Even as her eyes grew heavier, she kept looking at it. One small hand lifted again, weaker this time, reaching in its direction. Her fingers waved softly in the air, almost touching it. Trieu Duong watched that small effort with quiet emotion. It was exactly what he had imagined that morning. Something simple, something gentle, something she would want to reach for. He adjusted the cloth beneath her and made sure she was still comfortable. Then he stayed beside her, not moving away. There was no need to hurry. The work of the day could wait. This moment mattered more. Truc Lam's hand brushed the toy lightly. Then her arm relaxed. Her fingers slowly closed and opened once more, before resting against the blanket. Her eyes stayed on the toy for one last second, then began to close. Trieu Duong smiled softly. He looked at her, then at the small toy beside her, and then around the quiet home. Everything felt still, calm, and safe. For him, the toy was not just something to pass the time. It was a small step in her growth, a simple way for her to learn, a quiet answer to the way she had begun reaching out to the world. He sat there beside her, keeping watch as she drifted into sleep. Outside, the day continued. Inside, the moment remained gentle and full of warmth. After noticing Truc Lam beginning to reach for things around her, Trieu Duong realizes his daughter is entering a new stage of curiosity and growth. No longer content with simply watching, she now wants to touch and explore the world with her tiny hands. Understanding this, he decides to create a small, safe handmade toy that she can hold and gently shake. After finishing his daily chores, feeding the chickens and watering the garden, he carefully selects bamboo and wood, smoothing every edge to ensure it is safe for her. When he finally places the toy in her hand, Truc Lam slowly begins to grasp and react to its soft sound. In that quiet moment, a simple object becomes something meaningful, a father's love, guiding his daughter's very first steps into discovery.